All right, so we've got a really interesting deep dive ahead of us today, looking at all these resources you've sent over on decision trees and game theory.
Yeah, this should be fun.
Yeah, looks like you're trying to make some pretty big decisions.
Well, yeah, there are a few things I'm trying to figure out, and I think these tools could really help me get a handle on things.
So are you thinking more about like personal decisions or more professional or?
Kind of both, actually.
Oh, wow.
It's a mix, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, yeah, I mean, both decision trees and game theory, I mean, they're all about making smarter choices, right?
Yeah, they kind of work together, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Decision trees are great for when you're kind of like figuring things out on your own.
Right, it's like a roadmap for your thoughts.
Yeah, and then game theory comes in when you've got other people involved, like it's more of a.
Yeah, like a multiplayer game.
Yeah, exactly.
It gets a lot more complex when you have to factor in what other people might do.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, let's start with decision trees, since
Mm.
that seems like the more solo side of things.
Okay, sounds good.
So from what I'm seeing here, um, they're all about like breaking down a big decision into smaller steps.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
kind of like a divide and conquer strategy for decision making.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So instead of like getting overwhelmed by the whole thing.
Right, you break it down into bite-sized pieces.
Exactly. And that makes it way less intimidating.
Definitely.
So instead of just like going with my gut, a decision tree like forces me to actually think through all the possibilities.
Yeah, it's all about bringing structure and analysis to your decision-making process.
Yeah. And like one of the articles you sent mentioned this company that actually used a decision tree to decide whether to launch a new product.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
They factored in like market research, production costs, even like competitor behavior.
It's amazing how they mapped out all those factors, and I bet it really helped them make a more strategic decision.
Totally. So, I mean, that's like a real world example of how these things can be applied.
For sure, and I mean, businesses use them all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But, they can also be useful for personal decisions, too.
Oh, totally.
Like anything where you've got a lot of different factors to consider.
Right. So like if I'm trying to decide, whether to take a new job or like move to a new city,
Mm-hmm.
I could actually use a decision tree to kind of like map out all those different factors.
Exactly, and it can really help you clarify your thinking.
Yeah, totally. But I'm curious, like how do you decide which questions to ask at each step?
That's where things get a little more technical.
Oh,
It's not just about like randomly coming up with questions.
right, because there are like tons of factors you could consider.
Exactly. So decision trees actually use these mathematical criteria to figure out the best questions to ask at each point.
Okay, so there's like serious math happening behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But like in a way that makes sense.
Right. Like these criteria are all about maximizing the information you gain at each step.
Okay, so it's not just about like the questions themselves, but also like the order you ask them in them.
Right. And which questions lead to the most useful insights?
Gotcha. So it's like it's helping you be more efficient with your decision-making process.
Exactly.
Cool.
Hmm.
But I also noticed this word pruning mentioned in one of the research papers.
Oh, yeah. Pruning is super important.
What is that about?
So it's basically like when a gardener trims back the branches of a tree.
Yeah.
You want to make sure your decision tree doesn't become too complex or too specific to the data it was trained on.
So it's like you're preventing it from getting too bushy and overgrown.
Right. And it helps your decision tree focus on the most important factors.
So it's kind of like decluttering your decision-making process.
Exactly. Getting rid of the unnecessary stuff that could lead you down the wrong path.
So it's about making sure your decision tree is like flexible and adaptable.
Not rigid and over-specialized.
Right, because like life is always throwing curveballs.
Exactly. And you want your decision tree to be able to handle those.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
One of the articles also mentioned that decision trees can actually show you which factors are most important in making a choice.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the cool things about them.
Yeah, it's like getting a sneak peek into the decision-making process itself.
Right. You can see which variables really matter.
And that's awesome.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing even with all these advantages, decision trees aren't like a magic bullet.
Right.
So-
Of course not. Like any tool, they have their limitations.
Right.
Like, for example, they can be really sensitive to small changes in the data.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like if the input data changes even slightly, the whole tree structure might change significantly.
Wow. So it's kind of like a delicate balance.
Yeah, and sometimes life throws you curveballs that your beautifully pruned tree just didn't anticipate.
Right, like unexpected events or new information that comes up.
Exactly.
So while decision trees are great for mapping out your own choices, they don't really account for the fact that we're often making decisions in environments where other people are making choices too.
Right. That's where game theory comes into play.
Okay, so it's like leveling up the decision-making game.
Exactly.
Bring on the multiplayer mode.
Game theory recognizes that your choices are often influenced and sometimes even determined by the choices of others.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so it's like, if decision trees are about charting your own course, game theory is more like navigating a crowded room, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Like you got to be aware of everyone else and how they're moving.
Exactly. You're constantly anticipating and reacting to the actions of others.
So you're not just making decisions in a vacuum.
Nope. Your choices are intertwined with the choices of everyone else in the game.
That's where it gets really interesting, right?
Oh, yeah. It's like adding a whole new layer of complexity.
I'm seeing a lot about payoffs in these game theory resources.
Right. Payoffs are key.
So what are those exactly?
Well, they're basically the consequences of your actions in the game.
Okay, so like the outcome.
Yeah, they can be good or bad depending on how things play out.
So like if you win, you get a positive payoff.
Right, and if you lose, you get a negative payoff.
Okay, that makes sense. And game theory helps us figure out how to maximize those payoffs, right?
Exactly. It's all about making the best possible choices, given the circumstances.
I'm seeing this example here about two companies competing for market share.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
They can either cooperate on pricing or try to undercut each other.
Yeah, it's a classic dilemma.
It's like a high-stakes poker game.
Kinda, yeah. Each company has to weigh the potential benefits of cooperation against the risks of going it alone.
So like if they both cooperate, they might both make a decent profit.
Right, but if one company decides to cheat and undercut the other,
They might end up making even more money.
yeah, but they also risk triggering a price war, which could hurt them both in the long run.
So it's a really tricky balance.
It is.
But it seems like game theory isn't just about competition though, right?
Oh, definitely not.
I'm also seeing examples of cooperation.
Yeah, game theory can help us understand both competitive and cooperative situations.
So like when it makes sense to work together.
Right, like let's say two countries are negotiating a trade agreement.
Okay.
They each want to get the best deal for their own country,
Right.
but they also recognize that a successful agreement requires some give and take.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where everyone benefits.
Yeah, even if it means making some compromises along the way.
That brings us to this idea of a Nash equilibrium, right?
Oh yeah, Nash equilibrium is a central concept in game theory.
It's basically like a state of balance, right?
Yeah, where no player can improve their own payoff by changing their strategy alone.
Okay, so like everyone is kind of stuck, but in a good way.
Right. It's the most stable outcome given what everyone else is doing.
Like a group of friends trying to decide where to go for dinner.
Exactly. Everyone has their own preferences, but they eventually settle in a place where no one feels strongly enough to object.
That's a Nash equilibrium in action.
It is, yeah. It's all around us.
So I'm starting to see how this applies to so many different situations.
Oh, yeah. Game theory is everywhere.
From negotiating with your roommates to making decisions in a work team.
It helps us understand the dynamics of strategic interaction.
And make smarter choices.
Exactly.
But how does game theory actually help us make those smarter choices?
Well, it gives us a framework for analyzing situations where our choices are intertwined with the choices of others.
Okay, so it's like thinking a few steps ahead.
Exactly like a chess player.
Anticipating the moves of your opponent.
Right, and developing strategies that maximize your chances of success.
I'm also seeing different types of games mentioned here.
Oh, yeah. There are many different ways to classify games.
Like normal form, extensive form, cooperative.
Yeah, it can get a little confusing.
What are the main differences between those?
Well, they basically describe different ways of representing and analyzing strategic interactions.
Okay.
So like normal form games, they use a matrix to show all the possible strategies and payoffs,
Okay.
while extensive form games use a tree-like structure to represent a sequence of moves.
Oh, interesting. So it's like the difference between a snapshot and a whole movie.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
And cooperative games are all about situations where players can work together.
Right, like negotiating a contract or solving a problem as a team.
So the type of game depends on the situation and the nature of the interaction. You
Exactly.
got to choose the right tool for the job.
Right.
These resources even mentioned applications of game theory in biology and politics.
Oh, yeah. Game theory is surprisingly versatile.
It seems like it goes way beyond just economics and business.
Definitely, it can be applied to all sorts of fields.
So, like, how is game theory used in biology, for example?
Well, biologists use it to understand animal behavior.
Really?
Yeah, particularly in the context of competition for resources or mates.
So, like, animals are playing these strategic games too.
Yeah, in a way they are.
That's fascinating.
It is, yeah.
And what about politics?
Political scientists use game theory to analyze voting patterns, campaign strategies, even international relations.
Wow, so it's really a powerful tool for understanding how people interact.
It is, but like any model, it also has its limitations.
Right.
One of the big criticisms is that it often assumes perfect rationality.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that game theory often assumes that players always make decisions that maximize their own self-interest.
Okay.
But in reality, people are often influenced by emotions, biases, social
Again,
norms.
right, we don't always act like perfectly logical robots.
We don't.
Sometimes we make decisions based on gut feeling, loyalty, even spite.
Exactly. And game theory doesn't always account for those kinds of factors.
Another limitation is that real-world situations are often way more complex than the models used in game theory.
Yeah, that's true. It can be hard to capture all the nuances of real life in a simplified model.
So it's a useful tool, but we need to be careful about applying it too rigidly.
Yeah, game theory provides a framework, but it's important to remember that it's just a model.
And real life is always messy and unpredictable.
It is, yeah.
But even with its limitations, game theory still offers a powerful way to analyze situations where our choices are intertwined with the choices of others,
Definitely, it helps us understand the rules of the game, so to speak.
even when those rules are unwritten and constantly shifting.
Right, it gives us a language for thinking about strategic interactions
Anticipating the moves of others.
and making choices that increase our chances of achieving our goals.
It's like having a secret weapon in your decision-making arsenal.
Well, not so secret anymore, but certainly a valuable tool for anyone looking to navigate the complexities of a world where our choices are constantly intertwined.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from decision trees to game theory.
It's been a great discussion.
But let's shift gears for a moment and think about how all of this applies to you, the listener.
Okay, sounds good.
I mean, after all, the goal of this deep dive is to give you some tools that you can actually use in your own life.
Right, tools for making smarter choices.
So how can we take these concepts and apply them to our everyday lives?
Well, let's start with decision trees.
Okay, so we've been talking about decision trees and game theory, all this stuff. But how do we actually, use these things?
All right, how do we apply this to our lives?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all very interesting, but
It's going to be practical, right?
yeah, totally. So let's start with decision trees.
Okay.
Remember that company we talked about that used a decision tree to decide whether to launch that new product?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something you could actually do yourself,
Oh, absolutely.
even if it's not about business.
Right, it's a framework.
Yeah. So, if I'm trying to make a big decision, should I change careers or, move to a new city,
Mm-hmm.
I could actually, use a decision tree to break that down into smaller steps.
You could totally, and it can be really helpful.
So, what would be the first step?
Well, the first step is always to identify the main question you're trying to answer.
Okay.
That's your starting point, your root node.
Okay. So, for a career change, it would be should I stay in my current job or look for a new one?
Exactly.
Yes.
And then what
Then you start thinking about the key factors involved.
what are the pros and cons of each option?
Right. Those become your branches.
Yeah.
And then, the pruning part comes in to help me avoid getting lost in the details.
Exactly. Pruning is all about focusing on the truly important factors.
And letting go of the stuff that's just going to distract me.
Right. You don't want to get bogged down in the weeds.
Totally. So decision trees are a way to bring more structure to these big life choices.
Mm-hmm. And help you think through all the possibilities.
But then game theory comes in when there are other people involved.
Right. When your decisions are intertwined with the decisions of others.
Okay, so like a salary negotiation.
Perfect example.
It's not just about what I want. It's also about what my potential employer is willing to offer.
Exactly.
So I need to think about their perspective, their goals,
Yeah, you need to try to anticipate their moves.
and figure out a strategy that give me the best outcome.
And that's where game theory can be really helpful.
So I need to consider their incentives,
Mm-hmm.
their constraints,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even their personality.
All of that can factor into the equation.
And then remember that Nash equilibrium thing?
Oh, yeah, that's important.
So in a negotiation, that would be like finding a point where both me and the employer feel like we've gotten a fair deal.
Right, even if neither of us got everything we initially wanted.
So it's like a compromise.
In a way, yes, but it's more than just a compromise.
It's like finding a solution that works for everyone.
Yeah, a solution that's stable and sustainable.
I like that.
It's like a dance, you know?
Oh, yeah.
You're both trying to find a rhythm that works.
Even if it means making a few missteps along the way.
Exactly. It's all about adapting and responding to your partner.
That reminds me of something we saw in one of those game theory articles.
Which one?
The one about how cooperation can actually be a better strategy than competition sometimes.
Oh, yeah, that's a really important point.
Yeah, it seems kind of counterintuitive, but
Sometimes working together, even with a competitor, can lead to a better outcome for everyone.
so like businesses that form partnerships
Hmm.
or countries that collaborate on like environmental projects.
Exactly. Those are great
So
examples.
even in a world that's like obsessed with competition, there's still room for collaboration.
There is, and in fact, I think the ability to cooperate effectively is becoming increasingly important.
Especially in a world that's so complex and interconnected.
Totally.
So it seems like both decision trees and game theory ultimately come down to making smarter choices.
That's a great way to put it.
Whether we're like making those choices on our own,
Or in collaboration with others.
they give us a framework for thinking about those
The
choices
consequences of those choices.
and how our actions affect the actions of others.
Exactly.
We've really only scratched the surface here.
We have. There's so much more to explore.
But hopefully this deep dive has given you some new ideas.
And a fresh perspective on decision making.
I hope so.
The real learning happens when you start applying these concepts to your own life.
Yeah.
So as you go about your day, just pay attention to the decisions you're making,
The games you're playing.
the strategic interactions that shape your world.
You might even find yourself using a decision tree or a bit of game theory to help you navigate those tricky choices.
You might, and I bet you'll be surprised how helpful it can be.
That's it for our deep dive into decision trees and game theory.
Thanks for having me.
It's been fun.
It has.
Until next time, remember, every choice is an opportunity to learn to grow and to shape the game you're playing.
I like that.
Take care.
You too.